She was my speech teacher. And then as she retired, she told, we asked her, well, what are you going to do now that you're retired and you're not going to teach anymore? She goes, well, I'm going to write a book about someone I knew when I was younger. I go, oh, who was that? And she would refer to the guy who wrote the Conan stories. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Guy who wrote the Conan stories.
Yeah.
Okay. It's like, yeah, I read the comics, and I didn't realize Howard was
That's who
that
says
old.
it.
I thought, the Conan stories were relatively recent. And then in 1985, 5 years after she had retired and written the book, I got a copy of it, and that's kind of how it all came together at that point. Well, the first time I read the book, couldn't get through it. I read about a third of it and put it down because I thought it was kind of dry. I wasn't in the frame of mind to really actually plow through it. I was doing other things, and I wasn't really into the book at that point. Like I said, I got a copy of it. I read about, I don't know, 80 pages and put it down. Then about a year later, I went to see a movie called A Room with a View, and the Merchant Ivory picture they did. And I really liked the movie, and it was a small movie with really just three characters, and I go, wow, this is it was actually nominated for some Oscars, and I'm like, this is really cool. And I have this other book that Miss Ellis it's also a period piece. It's just a two-person thing. Maybe I should revisit it. And when I picked it up the second time, I got through the whole thing and saw the possibilities and said, yeah, this can make a good little movie, especially just two great characters, kind of uniquely American. And that's when I contacted Miss Ellis and asked her if I could write a screenplay for it. Then we optioned the book for $20, I think. And that's when I started writing the screenplay, and that's how it came together. So at first I wasn't sure, then I saw something else, and then that kind of was the incentive to actually sit down and write the screenplay. Well, I just thought he was kind of a guy. I always
Yeah.
I always consider him a sort of a blue collar writer because I really respect the fact that he wrote so much and had that discipline to sit down and write for 6 hours at a time. And I think he viewed himself not as a, some literary giant, but as a guy that kind of punches the clock, writes his thing, and then punches out. And writing for a particular market, and living as a sort of working writer who is paid to write different genres of things, and trying to sell it that way. And I've always respected him because I know how hard it is for me to sit down and even write for 2 hours. So I kind of think of him as a sort of working man, even though he was a creative person. He was more of a working, almost like a factory worker who was working with words. And I think he's, his suicide was a tragic thing, but I can understand at that time, at that point in his life, there were a lot of things happening, not just the death of his mother, but the fact that, Novalyne had left. He wasn't selling as many stories as he was before. A lot of his best friends had gone off to other things, and I mean, I think several things transpired to try and to kind of bring him to that point. And I think, who knows what would happen if those things, other circumstances hadn't played out. I mean, he may have well survived his mother's death and just been continued on and continued to write, because I think he probably would have had a very nice career, not only in literary, but if he had even gone to or tried out Hollywood, he might not have liked Hollywood at all. But he writes so visually, it would have been interesting for him to give it a shot anyway. It would have been interesting to see a Bob Howard screenplay. Well, her mission was to really kind of refute the stuff that was set of Howard in Dark Valley Destiny, which was L. Sprague de Camp's book. I mean, she cooperated with L. Sprague in the writing of it, but when she read it, she really thought he didn't capture the true person that she knew. And she really wrote that book to give people another side of Howard and the person, a first-hand account of him and what she thought of him, because she thought L. Sprague was a little hard on the darkness, the dark side, and the kind of eccentric side, whereas she saw him as a sort of a different sort of person. And she wrote the book really for that reason. Well, Miss Ellis, when Vincent D'Onofrio came to visit Miss Ellis and sat down and talked with her, that's what he kind of asked her. He said, "Well, what was he, what was he really like?" And the first thing she said is he was a big character, and he needs to be played big. So, with that in mind, if you're sort of a character to begin with, in a small town, with very conservative values and just almost in another planet as far as what you're doing and the society you live in, he's going to come across as a sort of little eccentric person. If he had grown up in Dallas or a major city, he probably wouldn't even been noticed as that at all. So, I mean, he was probably, yeah, I'm sure he was a little eccentric to some extent because his imagination was so great, but I just think it was the time and place that made him stick out, and not necessarily that he was a weird guy. He seems to me like a person that would have been really cool, fun to hang out with, because he was smart and obviously creative. It's just, I think it was just the town and the times, and that's all. Yeah, she enjoyed the movie quite a bit. I don't, of course, when you're doing a movie about someone's life, you're never going to get it exactly right. But she enjoyed it, and she liked that, and said we did a good job, and liked how it came out. So that was good. When she screened the movie, I couldn't sit in the theater and watch it with her because I was just too scared what she'd think. But she really did enjoy it, and of course she'll say a couple things like, "Oh, that wasn't quite right" or whatever. But she had no major criticisms of the film at all. And I just come back because I just like the people involved. I don't consider myself a Howard scholar, and I'm not on the same level as these guys who really study Howard and his work. I just like the people, the town, and the people associated with Howard, and I just really just come to see them because that's I met them. I just like them, and that's really the only reason I'm here. And to answer questions about the movie if people want to know about the movie, because it has kind of had a part in the Howard's popularity in the last 10 years. So his writing is very male-oriented, but the movie is really Novalyne story. It's not really about Howard per se. It's about their relationship. So it's really a relationship movie and not a biopic. So, and it really is kind of a chick flick for women about this guy who was a very masculine writer. So, and I think that appeals to a lot of people. A lot of people have been through relationships like that, where you're attracted to somebody, but you just, it's just not meant to be for one reason or the other. And I think women and men as well, can connect with that because everyone's been through that. Well, at the time she was teaching me, again, she was at the tail end of her teaching career. I was the very last class, and she had been at the school I was in, I think it was the last 3 years, 2 or 3 years that she taught. But she was a very commanding presence at the school. And, a lot of kids misbehaved in various classes, but they just didn't do it in hers simply because she just had that superiority thing that you didn't really mess with her, you didn't take advantage of her. Because she taught a speech class, she did an interesting thing, and I think she did this in all the classes she used to do, which her desk was never in front of the class, facing the class, was in back, raised on a pedestal. So the other desks faced away from her, but she was in back, kind of looking over your shoulder. So there was never anyone, you really couldn't turn around and talk to your neighbor. You couldn't, cheat or something because you didn't know if she was looking your direction, what was going on. And she could always see the whole class and who was in there. And of course, it helped for speech because when you made a speech, you went to the front of class and there was no table there to help you, so you had to face the whole class and the teacher when you did your speech. But I mean, she had those little tricks that really kept the order of the class. And of course, she obviously knew what she was doing, and was just a very regal sort of presence, but at the same time, very low key. So there were no behavioral problems or anything like that in her classes, just because she commanded your respect just by being there, really. Yeah, I mean, well, she was much lower key when I was there because she was in her 70s. But if you were doing something wrong, she would just give you that look, that stare, and you would just knew she was mad at you, and you would just be quiet. I never heard her raise her voice to anybody or anything. So even the baddest kids in class knew not to, fool around with the old lady, because if if you were kicked out of her class or something, you would be in major trouble. I think it was a romance. I mean, the romances back then were a little different from the way they are now. She'd once told us he was a really good kisser, so um, that's what he had said. But she was, at that time in the dating scene it was a little different. I mean, she had other guys she occasionally went out with. I mean, she was going with Robert relatively steadily until he kind of broke it off, and she started seeing Truett, who she thought was very attractive and very handsome. And so I mean the dating, I mean they were a couple, but it's not like today where they were super intimate and things like that. They would go on dates, they would do their thing. Bob was respectful and all that. So yes, it was a romantic relationship, and it may have it. Who knows? It might have worked out in the long run. It's hard to say, but I've always thought that the major obstacle between the two was they were very much alike, but whereas Howard wanted to stand out away from the crowd, Novalyne wanted to stand out within the crowd. And Bob could never go in the crowd and stand up. He wanted to be completely away. And that's very tough, because when you want to be a part of society but be special at the same time, it's a different dynamic to not wanting to be part of society at all and be your own person. And that's one thing they could never jibe together, because it was the same sort of thing. They wanted the same thing, but they weren't on the same track to achieve it. I think he is kind of the father of the sword and sorcery adventure, the sword and sorcery genre, in that he kind of started that there's obviously Tolkien and stuff like that, but in that sort of other world, sword and sorcery. I'm trying to think of the word for it. I don't want to say genre, but the pastiche or something. That sort of
fantasy kind of stuff.
yeah, the
Idiom.
yeah, the idiom, the fantasy, and that's kind of that's his legacy, and it's a huge legacy because most of the people, whenever you mention sword and sorcery or fantasy in general, you there's probably about 5 people you can stick on that, early work guys, and he's one of them, and if not the guy that really brought that sort of genre to the American public at that time. Because, you know, when you read Weird Tales, I mean, there's all sorts of stuff in there, but the his brand of sword and sorcery with the Hyborian Age and that sort of thing was pretty new and different and, you know, groundbreaking at that time. He helped me get, you know, he really was a key to getting the movie made, my film made. And without him and without Ms. Ellis, you know, I don't know what I'd be doing right now. You know, it was kind of the godsend that got me into, you know, the profession I wanted to be in. And that's what probably the most. I mean, I can't say he was the one that did it, because obviously Novalyne had a lot to do with that by writing her book. If she hadn't written the book, that probably never would have happened. So, but he's such a great character, American character, that in that respect, you know, it's a very important thing for me, because it just put me on a path to doing what I wanted to do.